Hey, it's Mackenzie, and this is me, Kirsty, and Claire's presentation for Teaching This Week on crossing borders, migration, and intercultural adaptation. So the objectives is the terms, the types of intercultural transients, the types of cultural contracts, crossing borders. This is the article called Micronesian in Hawaii, and also the activity we have planned for you. So the terms, a migrant is someone who moves to a different cultural context and changes their place of residence for an extended period of time. Next, we have voluntary migrants, which is a migrant by choice. They choose to leave their homes to travel or relocate. Next is sojourners, which are voluntary migrants who leave their homes for a limited period of time for specific purposes. For example, traveling for vacation. You see that with tourists. Also, international students, business or travel, or military personnel. Next is sojourners, which is voluntary migrants who leave their homes for a limited period of time. An example of this would be traveling for vacation, as in tourists, international students, business travel, or military personnel. Immigrants, on the other hand, are voluntary migrants who permanently settle in another country. Involuntary migrants are migrants who are forced to leave due to war, famine, political or religious persecution, or human trafficking. An example of this would be refugees who are forced to flee for safety from their country. We are seeing this a lot in Middle Eastern countries like Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. The difference between migrants and refugees is simple. Migrants make a conscious choice to leave their country to seek a better life somewhere else. Refugees are forced to leave their country because they are at risk and not safe. Types of intercultural transients. They use two key variables to describe the categories of cultural transients. The variables are length of stay in a culture and function of transient activity. Socioeconomic and political maintains a link with transient country of birth based on social and business reasons. The place of employment is at their home country. The difference between the service is that the former is often citizen of both the cultures or has permanent residency status and is not the place of business. Service employment category refers to transients whose move is often to seek employment in a foreign continent. Primary residence is often the country of birth. They enter one of the cultures in order to work on a periodic basis, and they may keep working in both cultural locations. Their employment is away from home and is temporary and seasonal. Short-term socioeconomic and political transients are transients whose reasons for moving repeatedly between two or more cultures are often socioeconomic or political. Short-term identifies these transients who spend 6 months or less in a culture before moving on to the next. Rossler in 1995 reported that German craftsmen denoted such travel patterns in Europe to fill the needs for such skills in certain geographic areas. An example of this is Nigerians in the early 1980s had to leave their country because the economy collapsed. People who had to leave were self-employed or who had low-paying jobs. Long-term socioeconomic and political transients are similar to those of short-term. However, instead of short-term, they spend a longer period of time in one of the cultures they encounter. They spend years in one culture and then move to another country and repeat that cycle. After years in living in another country, they'll return to their birth country, and they often return due to hard times, starting a new life, language barriers, and cultural differences. They stay in a different country for years to satisfy residency and then return to their home country. And starting a business in a different country, being successful, allows them to travel back and forth between their home country and the country that they're staying at once every 2 to 3 years. This can be seen with Hong Kong astronauts who spend time traveling back and forth between the US and returning to China for work. Citizenship provides for travelers to become long-term transients with easy entry and re-entry after long absence from a country. Immigration laws are critical in determining whether transient is short-term or long-term. Short-term service employment transients is one who primarily moves across cultural borders because of the demand of work and not because of social considerations. They are short-term because they spend 6 months or less in the culture. An example of this is seasonal migrant labor workers who are used a lot in the US, and there was a program created that hired agricultural workers from Mexico to work on the farms in the US. These workers returned year after year and often had employment in their home countries, working only seasonally in the US. Long-term service employment transients, again, is very similar to short-term. They spend a longer period of time in one of the cultures that they encounter. These people may spend a few years in employment in one culture, then travel to another country and repeat the process. An example of this is sailors or other military personnel that is in military duty and foreign employees. In the US, H-1B visa attracts foreigners to the country to fill shortages in several employment areas. These transients can travel back and forth between their homeland and the US during their periods of employment in the US, and it's not offered citizenship or permanent residency. The cultural contract theory states that intercultural relationships may or may not be coordinated depending upon the dynamics involved. They stress that cultural contracts theory appears to be the less appropriate theory for predicting how transients might shift their cultural identity. Ready to sign contracts describe situations where the transient has already made a determination on his or her cultural identity and feels little need to adjust that decision. The purpose is to avoid stress that can be caused by multiple adjustments. However, the drawback is cultural shock. There can also be lack of ongoing competence in at least one cultural location. This promotes assimilation and maintains the status quo, people in their own worldview, and refuse to see the value in alternative perspectives, communication, or perception. And they often think, I am not going to change who I am, so if you want this relationship to work, you must act like me. They do not wish to change themselves in the process. The quasi-completed is the cultural identity that is a mixture of predetermined identity and is a result of some openness to negotiation during multiple re-entry interaction. This is preferred by a transient who is neither fixed in his or her ways or fully committed to co-creating a cultural system. The purpose is to carefully choose of when to adjust in order to achieve predetermined goals. However, the drawback is there is possible cultural marginalization in each cultural system. This type of cultural contract is partially pre-negotiated, partially open for negotiation, an attempt to straddle the fence in maintaining the status quo and asserting one's identity within existing structures. The transient shows some willingness to negotiate, but is tempered by a desire to maintain one's worldview and some measure of control. Lastly is co-created contract, which is where cultural identity is fully open to negotiation. This contract is where the transient is fully committed to jointly negotiating a third culture with members of the host culture. The purpose is that it seeks full acceptance by hosts and transients work towards full competence. However, the drawbacks is that it's stressful and it must be socially active during each reentry. Hosts feel unfulfilled by relationships with transient because each host seeks transient assimilation to local culture and not a co-created culture outcome. In the article Micronesian in Hawaii, it starts out by talking about how Micronesians are Hawaii's newest arrivals in terms of immigrant populations. The Compact of Free Association migrants are those who come from Micronesia and Marshall Islands and can get benefits of those living in the U.S. due to being a U.S. territory. COFA migrants are the state's fastest growing immigrant population with an estimated 18,000 living in Hawaii. The Micronesians that come to Hawaii are often seeking health, education, and employment opportunity. In the article, it says a lot of them do not know what to wear. They don't have reliable contact numbers to reach them at, and unreliable homes that they're living in. They often arrive with low levels of education attainment, little money, and less than fluent English. In the article, a Chuukese woman named Helen described life in the Marshall Islands. There are about 25,000 residents on the islands, and she described that many of the outer islands get on by fishing and farming, all without electricity. She goes on to compare family obligations in the Marshall Islands and says that her family obligations will always come before others, even before work and school, which was hard to get used to. Socially, a large place to gather in Hawaii for Micronesians is at church. And Helen even goes on to say that Micronesians definitely live at a much slower pace and that she still struggles to get used to it. And although the official language of Micronesia is English, many migrants don't speak it and spend many months practicing and learning the language. In the article, Helen describes her daily work routine. She says 5 days a week she wakes up at 3 in the morning, catches the bus from Waianae to Waikiki, and starts her shift at 6 a.m. After work, it's another long bus ride home, then errands and chores, and the next day she repeats the cycle. This can be hard for her to get used to because, compared to Micronesia, where everything is close by, she now has a long journey to get back home and has to manage her time a lot differently than she did before. Josie Howard was one of the earliest Micronesians to travel to Hawaii under the act between the US and Micronesia. She now helps other Micronesians succeed in the US and says how their clothing is different. A lot of them don't know what to wear. I have to train people to get used to wearing pants. A lot of the women don't wear pants and they typically wear skirts and dresses. So she has to shift their view on this culture and get them used to their new way of life. Helen described how confusing Hawaii was for her at first. She had no idea how to figure out where she was, as street signs were a new concept for her, and she had to borrow a cell phone from a bystander so she could call her new boss for help. As for environment, she found it very disorienting and struggled to find her way back home every night. She described how different this was to Micronesia, where there was no electricity. The houses were made out of coconut leaves and local woods, and the people lived off the land, taro, and fishing. So, the activity is a little pull which you can access via the link on the PowerPoint. And here are just some of the questions you can answer through the link. What is a short term transient? Which is either someone who spends 6 months or less out of their birth country or someone who spends 6 months or more out of their birth country. This is a two-part question. So the first part, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be? The second part, why would you live there? Where in the world do you think has more immigrants? What are some reasons people are moving across borders? And that's it. So thanks for listening, guys. That was our teaching presentation.